Hello and welcome to Building Trust through Community-Specific Risk Communication in Brownfields Redevelopment. My name is Rupal Parekh. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Work and a co-PI at UConn TAB. Today's session is about something that sits right at the center of Brownfield work and almost never shows up in anyone's scope of work: how you talk with a community about contamination. If you work for a municipality, a land bank, or a regional planning agency, you've probably had the experience of walking into a room with good news and walking out with a problem. That is what this next 30 minutes is about: practical, evidence-based approach to communicating risk in a way that is specific to the community you're actually standing in. So let's get started. Here's where we're headed. We'll start by defining what community-specific risk communication actually is, because the term gets used loosely. Then we'll look at why technically accurate information so often fails to reassure people and why that isn't anyone's fault. From there, we will talk about some practical strategies. We will discuss how to read a community before you write anything, how to build a message people can actually use, and how communication gets sequenced across the whole life of the project rather than concentrated in one meeting. We'll look at 2 Region 1 projects that did this work well. You'll get a 1-page checklist that will hopefully be helpful in your next project. And we'll close by running the whole framework on a case I think you'll recognize. What is community-specific risk communication? Let's start with what the term actually means, because like I said, it gets used loosely. EPA defines risk communication as a dialogue, an interactive process of information exchange among the site team and the community that discusses the nature of risk and other concerns. So a few words really stand out in that definition, and I'd like to go over them. The first is dialogue. EPA calls this an interactive process of information exchange. That word matters, because most of what gets called risk communication is really distribution. We produce a fact sheet, we post it, we hold a meeting, and we move on. If we are not having a two-way conversation, we are not communicating essentially. The second word that I'd like to point out is risk, not just contamination levels. Everything people legitimately count as risk. And we're going to discuss that a little more in the coming slides. And the third piece, although not explicitly in the EPA definition, but more implied, is community specific. So what does that actually mean? 2 towns can have the exact same contaminant at the exact same concentration with the exact same remedy and need completely different conversations because the history is different, because the level of trust in local government is different, because in one town, the people closest to the site speak Spanish or Portuguese at home, and the other they don't, because what residents need to decide is different. So community risk communication means this: you don't start with a message, you start with the community, and the message follows from it. Hopefully today, you will learn the most effective methods for doing this well. So sometimes we have meetings that go sideways. You've done everything right. You have a phase 2 report, 340 pages, sealed by a licensed professional. Most of the soil results are below the residential criteria. There's one hotspot, you have a remedy for it, and the remedy meets the state standard. You booked the room, you made a deck. If you're lucky enough, people showed up. However, 45 minutes in, nobody has asked a single question about the data. What they're asking is, why now? Who decides what happens next? Is my daughter safe playing in that park? My mother worked in that building for 22 years. What does that mean for her? Probably most top of mind is, where were you people in 2019 when we called about the smell? Here's a thing to sit with. Nothing you said was wrong. Your numbers were right. your remedy was appropriate, your consultant did the work. It just wasn't an answer to the question being asked. But most people, when they experience something like this, decide the audience didn't understand. And what they need is a better explanation, a clearer chart, a simpler fact sheet. Unfortunately, this is probably the most expensive mistake in the field because it sends you back to fix something that was never broken. So let me show you a framework that explains what actually is happening in the room. This is the work of Peter Sandman, and it's, in my opinion, the most useful single idea in risk communication. The formula is fairly simple. Risk equals hazard plus outrage. Hazard, as most of us know, is the technical piece. How much harm the thing can actually do. Concentration, exposure, pathway, etc. It's what your consultant measures and what the cleanup standard is built around. Outrage is everything else people count on as part of risk. Whether they choose this or had it imposed on them, whether they have any control over what happens next, whether it feels fair that it landed in their neighborhood and not somewhere else, whether they've been told the truth before, and whether the thing they're afraid of is the kind of thing that actually frightens people. Here's really what I want you to think about. Experts define risk as hazard. The public defines it as outrage. When those two definitions collide in public meetings, each side concludes the other is being irrational. Sandman's point, and I want to be precise, is not that the public gets it wrong or that the experts get it wrong. It's that the public is using a broader and in some ways more complete definition of risk than we are. Control, fairness, honesty, and history are real things, and they matter. And this idea of hazard and outrage is not a new one. The CDC's own crisis and emergency risk communication manual, the federal standard, uses the same vocabulary. It defines risk perception as a combination of hazard, the technical or scientific measure of risk, and outrage, the emotions that the risk evokes. And it tells communicators plainly, don't dismiss outrage. So if outrage is a real component of risk, we ought to be able to predict it, and we can. Sandman identified 12 factors that drive outrage. I pulled the 6 that matter most for Brownfield, and I want you to score your own project as I go. Voluntary versus coerced. Nobody chooses to live next to a contaminated parcel. So that's coerced. Natural versus industrial. Contamination from a former plating shop isn't flood or a storm. Somebody did this. Individually controlled versus controlled by others. Residents don't decide when the trucks come, what the standard is, or when it ends. Fair versus unfair. Does this neighborhood already carry more than its share? In a lot of Brownfield communities, the honest answer is yes. Dreaded versus not dreaded. What do people picture when you say contamination? They picture cancer. They picture their children. And trustworthy versus untrustworthy sources. This is the one you have the most influence over, and usually the one where you're starting from behind, because somebody from an institution has often stood in the same room before and said something that turned out not to hold. On a typical Brownfield project, we're at or near the high outrage end on all 6 of those. High outrage is not evidence that you've communicated badly. It's the starting condition of the work. If you walk in expecting a calm technical conversation, you've misplanned the project. Now look at the right-hand column, because that's the practical takeaway. 3 of these 6 you can actually move. Control? Yes. Fairness? Yes. And trust? Yes. All respond to how you run the process. Dread, coercion, and industrial origin do not. So I want you to think about how you can spend your time building trust, making sure people feel they have control over the project and that the project is fair. So what do you do? What do you actually do to start? What do you actually do to get this started? The first move is counterintuitive. And it's where most projects actually go wrong. Before you write anything, before the fact sheet, before the website, before the meeting invitation, you learn the community. EPA Superfund Community Involvement Guidance is the most detailed federal material on this. And while it's written for Superfund, it adapts well for brownfields. Its core instrument is the community interview. EPA's community interview tool points to a long-standing directive recommending interviews with at least 15 to 25 people when you're building a community involvement plan. More if the site is complex or interest is high. In person is always recommended before you have a message to deliver. Not a survey, not a public meeting, real conversations. 4 things you're trying to learn during these conversations are going to be discussed next. First, what has the site already done to this neighborhood? Not the environmental history, the lived history. Who worked there? What closed? What was promised before and didn't happen? You will hear things that are in no files anywhere. I promise. Second, who do people actually believe? It's almost never the city. It's the pastor, the school nurse, the woman who run the block association for 30 years, the barber. Find those people and talk to them first. Third, what do residents actually need to decide or do? Are they choosing whether to let their kids play in a yard, whether to sell, whether to show up to a hearing? Your message should serve a decision they're actually facing. And fourth, how do they get information? And in what language? Facebook group, church bulletin, WhatsApp, the corner store window. Meet the channel that already exists rather than building a new one. And here is the payoff. When you do this first, the fact sheet almost writes itself because you already know the 3 questions it has to answer. When you skip this, you write a fact sheet that answers the questions you had, and you find out in a public meeting that they weren't the right ones. Once you know the community, there's a very old and very good set of rules for messaging itself. These are EPA's 7 cardinal rules of risk communication. Number 1, accept and involve the public as a legitimate partner, not an audience to be managed, a party with standing. Plan carefully and elevate your efforts. Communication gets a budget, a schedule, and a check on whether it worked. Listen to the public's specific concerns. Specific. So I'm not saying community concerns in the abstract, but the actual thing the actual person said. Be honest, frank, and open, including about uncertainty, which I'll come back to more later. Coordinate and collaborate with other credible sources, your health department, the state, a university, a local organization. A message carried by several credible voices lands very differently from one carried by a single agency. Meet the needs of the media. They have deadlines. If you're not the source, somebody else is. And speak clearly and with compassion. If you take nothing else from this slide, take 3 and 7. Listening specifically and speaking with compassion are the two things people feel in the room, and the two most often skipped when we're under pressure. Now let's get concrete about how a message is built. ATSDR teaches a technique called message mapping. Their structure is 3 key messages of about 9 words each, with up to 3 supporting messages under each one. For contaminated sites, the most useful way to organize those 3 is this: what we know, what we don't know yet, what we're doing about it, and when you'll hear from us again. Here's why the middle part is essential, and it's the part people are most afraid of. There's enormous temptation standing in front of a worried audience to say, there's no risk, there's no risk. Don't do it. You cannot keep that promise. Sampling data has gaps. Plans change. Something will come up. And when it does, that sentence becomes the only thing anyone remembers you said. Saying what you don't know does the opposite of what people fear. It doesn't undermine your credibility. It establishes it. If you don't know the answer, say so. Then say when you will know, and come back on the date that you say you will. And the piece tucked into part 3, when you'll hear from us again, gets dropped most often and costs the most. A community that knows the next update is October 15th waits until October 15th. A community that doesn't know fills the silence itself, and what fills it is rarely accurate and never generous. Give people a date, and then, of course, keep it. Now, plain language. And I want to be careful because it's often taught as use shorter words, and that isn't really it. Look at the before statement. Every word is accurate. It's how the finding will appear in the report. Soil sampling identified arsenic at concentrations exceeding the residential direct exposure criteria. A risk-based remedial alternative will be evaluated in the forthcoming ABCA. But I want you to now think about it as a resident. What's arsenic? Exceeding what criteria? What's an ABCA? And most importantly, what does this mean for me? Now the after statement. We found arsenic in the soil in the yard behind 42 Mill Street. The level is higher than what Connecticut allows for a yard where children play. Nothing needs to change today, and we'll cover the bare soil this week. We are deciding how to remove it, and we'll post the options on May 1st. Same finding, nothing softened, nothing hidden, but it names the substance, it names the place, a specific address, not the site. It explains what standard was exceeded and who said it. And it tells the person what changes for them right now and what happens next. That last part is what gets left out. Plain language isn't simpler vocabulary. It's answering the question, so what do I do? So my rule of thumb has 4 parts. Name the substance, arsenic. Name the place, the yard, the playground, not the site. Name the standard, whose rule, and what it protects. Say what changes for them this week. That's the whole point. One more thing worth mentioning, the Plain Writing Act of 2010 requires federal agencies to use plain writing in documents that explain a federal benefit, a federal service, or how to comply with a federal requirement. An EPA's Superfund Community Involvement Handbook directs site teams to, quote, communicate risk and exposure related information by translating technical data into language that can be easily understood by members of the community. So 5 pitfalls that happen to many of us. The first one really is leading with a report. You open with a methodology and reach the answer 20 slides in. Invert it. Lead with the answer, then offer the basic information. People who want the methodology will ask. 2, saying there's no risk. I'll say it over and over again. It's a sentence that gets quoted back to you. 3, treating one public meeting as engagement. 7 p.m. on Tuesday, in a building without parking, announced in a legal notice, is a compliance activity. It reaches the people who are already coming. 4, going quiet between milestones. Projects absolutely have long gaps. Waiting on labs, on a state review, on funding. From inside, that's absolutely normal process. But what does it look like from the outside? Silence after a contamination announcement reads as something being hidden. Send the updates that say, nothing has changed. Here's what we're waiting on. Next update in 6 weeks. This essentially takes 20 minutes and it buys you the whole gap. And 5, the most damaging, in my opinion, asking for input you've already decided not to use. If the remedy is fixed, don't hold a listening session on the remedy. Offer what's genuinely open, the schedule, truck routes, work hours, the reuse plan, the fencing. There's almost always something real to decide together. Asking about something that's closed teaches people that the whole process was a show, and you won't get the trust back on this project and maybe on others. So let's zoom out, because the biggest structural error in this field is treating communication as a phase rather than a thread. There are 5 stages, and each one, residents are asking different questions. So at site selection, the question often is, why this site and who decided? What you owe the community is the criteria you used to choose the site and a genuine chance to shape the reuse vision. At assessment, people may ask, what did you find? And is it dangerous? What you owe the community is results in plain language on a schedule, including the ones that come back clean. I would say especially those. A community that only hears from you when there's bad news learns to dread hearing from you. At cleanup planning, what are the choices? And do I have a say? For EPA cleanup grants, this isn't an option. You must publish a draft analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives. Advertise it locally at least 14 days before submitting and hold a public meeting. Treat that as a floor, not a ceiling. During cleanup, the question changes completely. It's dust, noise, trucks, hours, how long? Those are the daily life questions, and the project that answers them well is the project that people stop fighting. At reuse and stewardship, people might ask, did we get what was promised? And who's watching now? If there are institutional controls, a cap that can't be dug through, a deed restriction. Somebody has to explain those to the people who still will be there in 20 years. Trust travels through people who already have it. So your job is less to be trusted yourself, although that's always nice, but it's more to work through those who already have it in the community. On the left, you'll see different categories of community organizations or groups. So these are community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and so on. In most Brownfield communities, at least one of these already have a working relationship with hundreds of residents and may be difficult for you to build inside the life of a grant. However, what I see as a mistake is treating these groups as outreach, sending them a flyer and asking them to forward it. That's using trusted organizations as a mailing list, and people really feel that. Partnership is really what we want to focus on. Partnership means that they have a role in the work, a seat where decisions actually get made, and ideally a budget line, because their time is real. Now, I think because of time, I'm going to quickly run through one Region 1 project that was successful. But you'll have the PowerPoint and you can look at the other one. Meriden, Connecticut. The committee came first. So the Meriden Hub site had carried just about every use a downtown can produce. Metal products, manufacturing, glass cutting, lumber yards, dry cleaning, etc. And to mention, a regional mall built in the 1970s. Assessments in 2005 found petroleum, asbestos, PCBs, and other toxic metals and waste. And flooding along Harbor Brook in the 1990s had cost roughly $26 million in damage and closed the mall. So this was a hard site with a real history. Here's the thing that I'd like you to notice, and it's a sequencing point. In 2002, Meriden established a Blight and Brownfield Committee, about 24 stakeholders, including the EPA, local businesses, community organizations, universities, and city and state agencies. However, the first EPA assessment grant didn't arrive until 2004, and the park wasn't finished until 2016. So the committee was standing 2 years before there was any money, and it was still standing 14 years later when the ribbon was cut. That there is the lesson. Not that they held meetings. Most folks hold meetings. That they created a permanent named body with a seat at the table before there was a crisis to manage or a decision to defend. That's when it's the easiest to do, and it's exactly when it feels the least urgent, and why many communities don't do it. Just to let you know a little bit about where this project is now, 3 EPA grants of $200,000 each help leverage a $14 million project, with $8.8 million from Connecticut Deep and $4 million from DECD. Today, it's a 14-acre park with integrated flood control, a farmer's market, and links to the regional greenway. So this obviously was a success. And again, the thing that I'd really like you to focus on is how Meriden established a Blight and Brownfield committee prior to even applying for EPA grant assessment monies. So I'm going to skip the next example, but please do read through it when you have time. I do want to draw your attention to the communication plan, which is really a one-pager. So again, like I said, here's the whole thing on one page, 10 items. If you do these, you will have a real communication plan. Interview at least 15 to 25 residents before you write anything. Identify your trusted messengers by name. Write down the 3 questions your materials have to answer. Set a publication schedule with actual dates, including the no news updates. Decide your language and budget the translation. Name one person as the point of contact, a name, a direct number, and an inbox a human reads. Pick at least 3 channels. Say what you don't know every time. Be specific about what's genuinely open for input and what isn't, and close the loop. When community input changes a decision, say so out loud and say which input it was. The last one is the highest return item on the list, and it's always almost free. Most projects do take community input seriously, and then never. I'm sorry. Most projects do take community input seriously, and then never tell anyone that it mattered. 2 sentences. You asked for this, we changed that. Does more for trust than anything, another 20-page fact sheet ever will. So again, please look at the 5 things to take with you. We don't have time to discuss it, but we've gone over it. So thank you again for spending this time with me and for the work you're doing in your communities. 3 ways to reach us: the general inbox that goes to the whole team and someone will route it to the right person. If you want to see who we are and contact someone directly on our team, please, sorry about that, go to Meet the Team email. And if you have a project you'd like help with, the Municipal Assistance Program opens for requests 3 times a year. That's all on the main website. So you can see that there. And my email is right here. So please feel free to contact me directly as well. Thank you again. I appreciate your time and have a nice rest of your day. Thank you.